Hi, it's Laura Deckham, Reading 18 Tarot and Books. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome. I am here on the last day of Pride Month, June 30th, with a video inspired by some comments and questions and conversations that I've had over the past couple of weeks, couple of months, that I wanted to ramble about because they've come up enough times that I feel like there must be something interesting there that people are curious about or interested in having a conversation about. So this is that video. I'd hoped to make more Pride-related content this month than I've had time to do or energy or capacity to do, but I have some more ideas, and this channel is queer year-round, so there will be more coming. It just won't be during the month. You'll know from the title of this video, which I haven't come up with yet, but have a sense of what it will be, that the topic that I want to talk about is the idea of non-obvious representation. And this has specifically come up in the context of queer representation or 2S LGBTQIA+ representation in the context of Pride Month and in the context of tarot specifically. So I was really struck by the frequency with which this has come up. A number of times independently of each other. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it. I put out a invitation to make some suggestions about potential kind of Pride videos that I might make, and a couple of comments came in, that relate to this idea of not obvious representation there. It's also come up in a couple of kind of interpersonal conversations and Discord conversations, such that I feel like, if something's going to come up that much, the sheer frequency with which this idea of non-obvious representation has come up in my life in the last month or two makes it a thing that I want to talk about, even though I feel like my thoughts are not very well formed. So this is just going to be one of those ill-planned rambles, right? So, non-obvious representation. I've had a couple of comments that ask about ideas like decks that are not obviously queer decks or are not obviously 2S LGBTQIA+ decks, but that either speak to me as a member of the queer community or speak to me for Pride Month or reflect kind of aspects of my lived experience in relation to that. Also, specific tarot cards that speak to particular aspects of queer life, or like my queer life, presumably. Particular cards that, I might find relatable in terms of, aspects of my life experience, but that are not obviously queer cards. I've also had some conversation about kind of, this is, in the context of supporting 2S LGBTQIA creators during Pride Month and always, the ways in which the decks that members of our community create might or might not, reflect, a particular kind of like queer sensibility or like have a particular queer vibe about them, even though they may not be kind of in decks with people in them. They might not be decks that have any kind of theme. By like theme, I mean decks kind of like the Gay Marseille or, things like this that are very clearly, very specifically focused on representing the community. Members of our 2S LGBTQIA+ community obviously make all kinds of things, like all kinds of decks, many of which do not do that. And so like are those queer decks? What does that mean? So all of these different kinds of conversations about subtle representation or like not obvious representation. And so I want to talk about this because it's really it's been really preoccupying me, actually, trying to think through this and the frequency with which it has come up. And feeling like I want to say something about it, but not really knowing exactly what that is. So I'll just preface this, like, besides the fact that I'm saying, like, this is a ramble, be prepared. Like, this is not organized at all. I haven't really planned anything. But also, I also want to preface this by the fact that, you know, this is not me trying to kind of single out or make feel bad anybody who made any particular comment or asked any particular question or participated in any particular conversation. Not at all. I do think that there are some things to unpack with the idea of kind of not obvious or subtle representation. And I think that some of those things are problematic in particular kinds of ways. My intention is not to suggest that I think that there was like ill intent in any of this at all. I don't think that was the case. So I don't intend it in that way. I want to also, just before I forget, because I know I'll forget, I want to link to a video made by my friend Avery Fawcett. I'll link below. This is from a couple of years ago when I made my first 2S LGBTQIA+ decks video, which mine was VR to Tom Benjamin. Avery also made one, but Avery specifically made queer decks. And by virtue of doing that, has different kinds of conversations about what that means than what I had with mine, because I was very specifically focused on sharing decks that depict us, that depict our community. Whereas because Avery goes in a slightly different direction, Z gets into questions like what a queer aesthetic might be, and like a queer vibe to a deck that may not, at least not in any explicit or acknowledged way, like represent people who are members of our community. So this video may be of interest to folks who have asked some of these questions, and I think that Avery gets at a lot of interesting kind of lines of thinking in relation to this, and makes many kind of suggestions that I would echo. So I'll put that there. So my initial reaction, and I'm just going to be honest, my initial reaction to this kind of conglomeration of comments and questions about the non-obvious decks and cards that speak to the queer or to us LGBTQIA life or to me, but are not obvious. My initial feeling of that was like, oh, you mean that don't have me in them? Because what is obvious, right? And I took this question to my spouse, and I pointed, like, my spouse's usual chair is over there. It's like not sitting there right now, but that's why I'm pointing. Habit. I took this question to my spouse and was like, this thing has come up, and I just want to kind of throw some, summary of this at you and see what you think. And I said, these are the kind of comments and questions and conversations, like this idea of the non-obvious, like speaking to queer representation in not an obvious way, or representing queerness in a not obvious way, or being relatable to queer experience in a not obvious way. Like, what's your take on that? Or like, what would you initially think of that? And my partner's reaction was like, don't be flamboyant and don't bring any flags. Was like, is that not obvious? Like, be subtle was the initial thought. And again, like, this is not what I think anybody was implying when they made these comments or asked these questions. But I think it's also like an inevitable place for my brain to go, given the frequency and severity of attacks on our community's visibility, very specifically right now, right? By which I mean things like bans on Pride festivities, by which I mean things like book bans, removing books that depict us from libraries where precious innocent children might see them and know we exist as a result, right? Pressure on companies to not sponsor Pride festivities, and this being a kind of public image thing for, in a capitalist context, to avoid kind of boycott, like right-wing boycotts and this kind of shit, right? All of these things are very particularly attacks on our visibility to, and be an ability to be visible in public, in media, in culture, in our communities even, right? Policing of our visibility, right? And I've experienced like actual physical attack in this way as well, right? Like how dare you be out in public like that, kind of thing. So, given that kind of broader like policy and legislative and cultural context around our visibility right now, I think that it's only obvious that the idea of, what could reflect me but not be obvious, like immediately felt like, oh, like something that doesn't depict us then, right? No flamboyance or flags. And so I'm not, in case it wasn't obvious, I'm not going to make a video of like cards and decks that speak to me but don't picture me, that don't, they're not queer themed, but if I work my interpretive muscles and my optimism really hard, I could find myself there. Like, and again, I don't think that this was the intention of these conversations, right? Like, not at all, right? But trying to think about doing this feels like a particular kind of contortion of my mind, right? And I think it also has thrown me for a bit of a detour, thinking detour, meandering thoughts, about what is obvious representation. Because the idea that there are decks and cards and artworks and all these things that are not obvious queer representation, but that are reflexive of queerness in some way, or reflexive of my life experience in some way, with specific reference to kind of gender and sexuality, which is how I take that. Like, these comments imply, like, on the flip side, that there's something that is obvious, right? What is obvious representation, right? And I think that in the context of the tarot conversation specifically, I would understand obvious representation, or like cards and decks that are obviously speaking to queer life, to be those that have like a very obvious theme, like queer tarot, Gay Marseille, and Silicon Dawn, and these kinds of Next World, Numinous, like decks that are very specifically articulated by their creators in the kind of description of the deck, in the guidebooks, like are very, very specifically positioned in this kind of way, right? Because outside of that, it is not at all clear to me as a politically aware, self-aware, genderqueer, bisexual person, like what, for example, bisexual representation looks like. Obviously I have a personal sense of what that means for me personally, but I don't think there's really anything obvious about it, because obviously you can't tell just by looking at someone, like whether that be someone in a tarot card or somebody walking down the street. You can't tell these aspects of someone's identity just by looking at them, right? Unless we are really talking about like pride flag t-shirt kind of thing. Like, you can't. So that would mean that not obvious representation in tarot context would be something like decks or cards that are not overtly positioned as relating to your community or your identities, but that somehow feel resonant, right? And I think that that's an interesting question. I don't know that I'm going to make a video about this, but I mean, I know that I'm not, but I do think it's an interesting question. right? Like what makes particular decks feel relatable to particular people? And I think that that's a big, complex conversation that lots of people would have lots of very different takes on. What makes a deck relatable to us? And I think it's particularly perhaps an interesting conversation in tarot context as opposed to in, say, like media context or artwork context more generally, because I think that a lot of us who read tarot, and you can tell me if I'm wrong in the comments, or you can tell me if I'm right, but I think that a lot of us operate, you know, as diviners, as fortune tellers, as readers, like whatever, however we kind of position ourselves. I think a lot of us operate with the, if not explicit commitment, at the very least underlying assumption that the tarot deck, by which I mean the structure, the 78 cards, the system or systems, lineages, tarot deck, capital T, capital D, the tarot, can and does represent and speak to all aspects of human experience. I think that when we read, we often operate under this assumption, right? And I think that we do so very often in ways that are not at all deck specific, right? I recently read tarot at a market locally. I've done it a number of times now. They tend to be around solstices and equinoxes. My friend organizes them. And I had, a booth for a couple of hours, and people could come and get readings. And I picked a couple of decks to bring with me, and each time I bring, maybe 3 decks or 4 decks at most, and people can pick what one that they would like. And of course, going into an event like this, I have no concept of what kind of questions I'm going to get. I have no real sense of who my clients, querents, are going to be, right? Beyond the kind of very general sense of who tends to go to this particular event. There's a lot of regulars, there's kind of demographic realities of who's around in the town that I live at. Like, I can generalize in a very general way, but I don't know who's going to come and sit down at my table, and I don't know what they're going to ask, right? But I bring a handful of decks, knowing that people have different artistic tastes and, are drawn to different things, in hopes to bring something that people will be attracted to. And I do think about diverse representation when I am choosing decks for that, with view of the diversity of the people who might sit down with me. But okay, to take an example of something that is on my mind lately in my personal life, an experience like discrimination at work, right? Discrimination at work affects to us LGBTQIA plus folks. It also affects, many other intersections of identity and of people, right? Certainly not an uncommon experience. And work questions, I find, are very common questions when you're reading tarot in public, or even for friends and family, right? Like, there's a handful of life areas that when you're getting people asking you for readings that come up over and over again, and work is one of them. Will I get the job? Will I get the promotion? What can I do to stand out to get, the move to the different role that I want? I have my performance review coming up. Like, what's that going to be like? All of these kinds of things. Workplace discrimination could enter into any of those things, right? And as a tarot reader, I operate on the sense that would come through in a reading. And that would come through in a reading, whether I was reading with a deck, that very specifically spoke thematically, in a way that would point me that way or not, right? If that's a salient aspect to the thing the person is asking about, which it may well be, then I have to, in terms of how I think of tarot working, like, I have to think that it's going to come up, and I'm going to be able to pick that out, right? I think that as a reader, it's my responsibility to be aware of that as a reality that faces lots of people, so as to have that, as something that could come up in a reading if it had to come up, right? This is what happens. This is what happens when I don't plan what I'm going to say. Where I'm going. Okay. So if we operate on the assumption that any deck can speak to this, right? That I've brought 4 decks to a market, and regardless of which one a client picks, whichever one they pick based on the artwork that they like best, if they're dealing with a situation that has to do with workplace discrimination, which I'm unfortunately have been dealing with, as a person lately, I believe that will come up in the reading, regardless of what the deck is, right? So in that sense, the idea of thinking about cards or decks that could speak to an aspect of queer life experience in a not obvious way, I would say in some ways, like any of them, right? Any of them. And, there's been lots of good conversation, I think, in tarot spaces about the challenges of not being able to find decks that represent us, the negative experience of always kind of having to read decks that don't feel like they were made for you, that don't feel like they reflect you, that don't, that don't obviously represent you in one way or another. And of course those conversations are happening because representation is important. Right? Representation is profoundly important. Representation would not be so vehemently under attack if it was not profoundly important, right? Growing up with not a lot of visibility of 2S LGBTQIA plus, people in my life or in the media that I was accessing or these kinds of things, affected me negatively. Absolutely affected me negatively. Affected my life trajectory negatively. Affected my sense of self negatively. Affected my ability to vision a adulthood for myself negatively. Right? Because you can't see it happening anywhere, then how can you possibly think it, right? Representation is really important. Diverse representation is really important. Queer representation is really important. To us LGBTQIA plus community representation is really important. It continues to be really important and is really important in all of the months and not just June. Right? And maybe that's where I end this ramble, because if I keep going, I don't know where I'm going to end up. I don't know. I think I'll probably post this. I don't know. I feel like I'd wanted, in the back of my mind, I'd wanted to get somewhere in this conversation to the idea of something like reading queerly and having that as a kind of angle of reading that is not particular to decks or art or anything like this. A kind of anti-normative orientation towards the world in general, drawing on kind of queer theory and activism perspectives, with an eye to the way in which maybe tarot reading and tarot decks and tarot cards and all these things that we love, I hope that tarot can be a part of making queer life and queer futures more livable, more imaginable. I hope that tarot can be a part of ongoingly those kind of conversations about the importance of representation, and can be a site of visibility and a site of representation at times when that is met with so much hostility, right? I hope that our tarot community will continue to, or will, it is what it is. I hope that our community will celebrate representation and celebrate queer decks and 2S LGBTQIA decks and readers and creators year round, and do so in a vocal way. Yeah, I think that's my conclusion to that. So I appreciate that this is not at all what anybody probably was looking for when they asked me about non-obvious representation, but throw something at me and give me a chance to ramble, I will. I highly doubt anybody will watch this to the end, but if you did, thanks for sticking with me. Happy Pride year round. See you again soon.